definitely positive. Check if you can find something in the fraction.
In Bremerhaven, Alan Simbella is informed about the finding off the Irish coast via satellite phone.
Hallo Simbella? Ah, hallo, wie geht's dir auf der Heike?
Wirklich, super. Also ist es bei Spiral 7?
There is some rather dramatic evidence to show that in the last several decades the frequency and severity of harmful blooms has, at least on a global scale, increased. Not everywhere, but in many locations, and the trend is definitely on the increase.
Here in Matnog, just south of Sarsogon Bay, the people have not had any serious problems with algal blooms to date. The ecosystem is functioning well and the quality of the water is still good. Local fish species are sold on the market, a sign that the people here can still live from the sea. Local fishermen have stopped catching fish in the wild, but instead started their own fish farms where they breed local fish species in small cages. They are fed mainly with rice.
In this area, life and fishing belongs together. When we started this fish cage, we did this without any outside help, but it is working. Now a new program provided by the government teaches the new way of fishing to others. We have two lagoons here, White Lagoon and on the other side Taraksan, and the plan is to build fish cages in both of these lagoons.
However, more and more commercial fish farms pose a serious risk to the environment. They could eventually lead to oxygen deficiency and man-made harmful algal blooms. It's a horror scenario that would also destroy the dense coral forests, which grow only a few hundred meters from the fish farms. But the plan is set. 1 year from now, an industrial-sized fish breeding facility will begin construction. The Tal volcanic lake near Manila is a prime example of how industrial fish farming can destroy the resource it is based on. This area is covered with fish cages, although the area is a nature preserve. The fish are fed with high-grade fodder in order to maximize their growth, ideal conditions for algal blooms.
In Bolinao, there was a very big fish kill, but it affected the area for almost a month. And tons of cultured fish died. Apparently, it was the excessive feeding of the fish, that opportunistic organism multiplied and then caused the red tide.
Algal blooms paint the sea in different colors. For example, red, like the red tide in Florida, or green, like the cyanobacteria in the Baltic Sea. The green-brown sludge that can sometimes cover the entire Baltic Sea is made up of millions and millions of cyanobacteria. They usually bloom in summer, when the water temperature is higher and contains sufficient nutrients. During the cold winter months, the algae fall into a form of hibernation on the seabed. Once the temperatures rise and the nutrients in the water increase, the single-celled algae awaken and rise to the surface in columns. During their ascent, they multiply rapidly. In this way, a massive algal bloom is able to develop within a short space of time. When the bloom is over, the algae die and sink to the seabed once more. Here they are decomposed by bacteria that use up all the oxygen present in the water for this process. An oxygen-depleted dead zone develops. Only the white strains of bacteria are able to survive in this zone. All other organisms flee or perish. The Leibniz Institute for Baltic Sea Research in Warnemünde is home to a sediment archive capturing the history of the Baltic Sea dating back thousands of years. Thomas Leipe, a marine geologist, deciphers the sediment cores and studies the oxygen-depleted dead zones of the past.
Wir haben hier einen Sedimentkern aus der zentralen Ostsee, der uns
Here we have a
die
sediment
letzten
core from the
10.000
Central
Jahre
Baltic Sea.
Ostseegeschichte widerspiegelt.
It is able to reveal the
Das
history
beginnt
of the
hier
last
mit dem
10,000 years in this region.
Baltischen Eisstausee. Das sind
It begins here with the light grey clays. During this time, the seabed was well aerated. Here we see very fine layers of lamination, which were caused by saline currents from the North Sea. In the upper area, we have another section of fine layering. This indicates that at this point in time there were no organisms living on the seabed, which could have destroyed the fine lamination.
The sediment sample clearly indicates that the cyanobacterial blooms have always existed in the Baltic Sea. But in the last decades, these oxygen-depleted dead zones have expanded significantly. Intensive agriculture, use of fertilizers, air pollution, and insufficient wastewater treatment are to blame for this increase. More and more nutrients are flowing into the sea. The most oxygen-depleted regions in the Baltic Sea are located near large cities. Daniel Conley, a marine geologist, and his team regularly study the distribution of dead zones around the Stockholm archipelago. Sweden has been fighting the expansion of dead zones for the last 30 years. Wastewater treatment was modernized, use of fertilizers was strictly regulated, and the emissions of vehicles and industry reduced. The research team wants to assess whether these measurements have had any effect on the Baltic Sea ecosystem.
The dead zone in the Baltic is probably the biggest natural area that's dead. And today it's an area of the size of 41,000 square kilometers, which is about the size of the country of Denmark. And it's not just in terms of area, it's volume. It starts at about 100 meters and goes down to the bottom, which is in many areas several hundred meters deep. So it's a tremendous volume of water that has no oxygen in it.
The tension rises as the first sediment core is brought on board. No improvement. The seabed is still black, an indicator for oxygen depletion.
Okej, håll i där nere. Stabilt, så.
Alan Simbella has come to a shipyard to investigate how small organisms like algae can travel over large distances in the ocean.
Here you can see these holes on the side of the ship, which is basically for the passage of the ballast water. This is very important that the ship is capable of taking on ballast water to maintain the equilibrium of the ship.
Alan Simbella believes that to understand the spreading of exotic algae in the oceans, you have to understand how large ships operate. For example, when the vessel reaches its destination, the water in the ballast tanks gets emptied into the sea.
Even though this is only a medium-sized freighter, at full capacity it can load up to 21,000 tons of ballast water. And essentially contained in that ballast water, when the ballast water is taken on board, the whole biological community that's represented in there is carried along with it, essentially as hitchhikers in the ballast water. Of course, the ballast water tank is not a very pleasant environment for these species. They like to have light and they like to have relatively warm waters. But under these unfortunate conditions for them, they normally form resting stages. They stop swimming and they will gradually sink to the bottom of the ballast tank, where they become part of the sediment component. And often the sediment is simply discharged into the local harbor, representing a major source of inoculum for a potential bloom of an exotic species.
As international shipping traffic has rocketed over the last decades, also more and more exotic organisms have been located in different parts of the world. One example is the toxic algae which was first discovered in the Killary Fjord.
To date, it has been found in the UK, it has been found in France, in Spain, in Portugal, in Morocco, and going north from Ireland, it has also been found in Norway and Sweden. So it's not just an Irish problem.
The expedition on the vessel Heinke is coming to an end. The researchers have accomplished one important task: to identify the toxin azaspiricid. Now they also want to find the organism that produces the toxin. Urban Tillman uses a net to collect plankton. The device also collects water samples at the same time, so that he can search for even smaller organisms in the probe.
We have analyzed hundreds of samples for the presence of azaspiricid until we were able to locate the toxin in one single sample. From this one sample, we were able to isolate a species of algae that could have produced the toxin. In laboratory cultures, we were able to show that this algae species indeed produces azaspiricid. It was a long process, but with a happy ending.
The difference between success and failure of this scientific mission was on the edge. But one probe was enough. The samples showed the same algae species that poisoned Simon Kennedy's mussels and resulted in the hospitalization of 8 people in the Netherlands.
Today we were able to prove the existence of the organism under the microscope. The organism is extremely small, about 1/10,000th of a millimeter in size. Furthermore, water samples usually contain many more organisms of the same size, making isolation very difficult.
Back at the Alfred Wegener Institute, the implications of this successful expedition are becoming clearer. The new algae are bred in a cooling chamber, as Alan Simbella needs them to develop a revolutionary early detection system for algal blooms that utilizes so-called microarrays.
A microarray, there are many different varieties, but quite simply, it's a matrix of genes that we spot on a glass slide. You can't actually see the little points because they're microscopic, but one glass slide can contain tens of thousands of different genes spotted on the slide. So that gives us a molecular fingerprint, if you will, of each algal type. And among those genes, we try to focus on genes which are responsible for expression of toxicity. These genes are then coupled to a color marker. And so what we have is different color combinations. So we can have red, we can have green, or yellow. So it's like a traffic light. And this can then help us not just to detect which organisms are present, but in fact, whether they have the capability to produce toxins.
In a few years' time, these microarrays will be integrated into a probe drifting on the ocean. This probe will constantly monitor toxin-producing algae and relay this data to a satellite. Such an early detection system would be able to assist farmers in planning their harvests, saving them time and money.
It's a huge benefit that we can recognize the toxin AZA. Well, that would be of enormous benefit to the industry, to be able to have an early warning system.
Since the continuous monitoring has started, one can claim with confidence that the mussels that enter the market are safe to eat. This implies not only to Irish mussels, but also to shellfish from other countries in the Western world.
Interestingly enough, I actually eat more shellfish than before I became actively involved in the field. So yes, I am obviously very careful about where I select my shellfish. For example, one thing I don't do, and I wouldn't advise anybody else to do that, is to go off on unexplored shores and simply dig for mussels or clams and prepare that oneself without having a quality control on this. This is what I would describe as biological Russian roulette. You really don't know the hazard that you're dealing with, and it's probably better to get your seafood from a market where you know that quality control has been respected.
In Sweden, Daniel Conley and his team are about to make an important discovery.
One of the things that we have heard about that we are really interested in hearing is that there's been improvements in the Stockholm archipelago with reductions in nutrients. And so we're real